because the danger with just counting the number of women is that maybe women can be admitted to work there, but they're not accounted for in decision making. So what happens is like tokenism or window dressing. As long as we have increasing number of women, then we automatically think that organization is inclusive.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the first episode of our Breaking Barriers podcast as part of Cazadira Foundation's Global Future X initiative. My name is Indira Zahra-Aridati and I'm a policy manager at Cazadira Foundation. In this podcast, we will be talking about the challenges and opportunities that our world currently faces. We will also talk about the solutions that can be implemented to break barriers and build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic. Our aim is to solve the future now. This season, we will focus on the theme of women in leadership, where we will hear stories from amazing women working in public, private, and community sectors. One way we can build back better is to ensure gender equality in all of aspects of work. For today's episode, we are joined by Cazadira Tamzil, also known as Azira, who is a public policy expert and director of Global Future X by Cazadira Foundation. Hello, Azira. Good morning.
Hi, Indira. Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. And of course, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, it's my pleasure to be here. We've talked about this podcast for quite a while, and so it's very interesting to see it come to life now. And we're talking about a very important topic, which is gender equality. And all of us as women, I think, have a personal take on this issue because there is still gender inequality. A lot of women are still left behind, even before the pandemic.
Yes, so now going maybe to your own personal experiences of this topic, can you tell me a little bit about your background? I understand that you have had experiences both in the private sector as well as in the community field. So if you want to share a little bit about that.
Of course. So actually my background is in international relations, my academic background. And then when I came and entered the professional workforce, I worked in public policy. At a glance, these seem quite similar, but actually when you're talking about public policy, you're talking more concrete stuff like regulations or policy directions from national governments and local governments that actually impact virtually the lives of all of the citizens and non-citizens living in a particular geographical boundary. I think the last few years, I've been working as, I would like to call it like a bridge between public, private, and community sectors. So advising government agencies, private companies, and community organizations, and as well as international institutions and global philanthropies on how public policies impact trade, investment, and sustainability across different markets in Southeast Asia. I think from my experience the last few years, oftentimes we all are working towards the same objectives, but we speak different languages. And so that's kind of where sometimes communications breakdowns happen and mistrust also occurs, is that we don't speak the same languages, and so there's not really that much trust. So yeah, that's a little bit about my background.
Oh, okay. Thanks for sharing. I think that's one of your many hats from what I've heard. So that was a little bit more about your experience in the public policy sector and more of your formal work. I also know that you have led some communities. Can you talk a little bit maybe about that?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I think a lot of women these days, and also men, they wear different hats. They have different roles, both in the domestic setting or also in the public setting. And even in the public setting, we have like formal employments and we have maybe like community related activities or efforts, right? And I think the last few years, my community activities have focused a lot in the education space. So kind of providing mentorship for our younger generation on how they can improve their skills and capacities and how they can, basically get better education, better employment as well. And also have or lead meaningful lives, so they don't only work for themselves, but they actually build others as well. So yeah, that's a bit about that community related work or activities.
Yeah. Thank you very much, I guess, for sharing both sides of the stories and your different roles across of the sectors. And I think across the different geographies and income levels, this is a great example of, I think, a woman who has succeeded in the different sectors, but in other parts of the world, maybe women have been underrepresented, especially in terms of work. There are a lot of gender-based discrimination and sometimes unconscious biases. And to be where you are today, to see this example of success, I would say, do you have any examples maybe from your personal life where there were struggles to get to where you are today?
Yeah. So I think I've been very fortunate to not have experienced meaningful gender-based discrimination. I think, obviously I come across people who have certain biases against women and all that, but I think I've been very fortunate that at least in my professional work life, I've never really come across people who blatantly, refuse to promote me or hire me because I'm a woman. But I understand that a lot of people are not as fortunate as that. And that's why I think this podcast is very important because, one way, as you mentioned, to build back better is to ensure that every component, every element in society are basically leveraged meaningfully to create, diverse environments, and basically everyone can, leverage their own modalities to help improve the state of the world, right? But yeah, I think one important thing that we need to talk about when we talk about gender equality is not just improving or increasing the number of women in the workforce or increasing the number of women in certain institutions or sectors, because the danger with just counting the number of women is that maybe women can be admitted to work there, but they're not accounted for in decision making. So what happens is tokenism or window dressing. As long as we have increasing number of women, then we automatically think that organization is inclusive or diverse, but that's not always the case. So I think one way forward when we talk about gender equality, we need to talk about meaningful participation from both men and women. Basically how when we are looking to hire people or we're looking to promote people, we don't see them as men or women. We focus on their talents, their traits, and their merits.
Thank you. I think this is a great example of the best practices that maybe you have seen in your line of work, as well as the different sectors that you have been exposed to. Going back to the topic of women in leadership and gender equality, the past 2 years of the pandemic, we have seen how gendered the impacts of the pandemic have been, and maybe that goes back to our earlier conversation about wearing many hats.
Yeah.
And for women, one of the reasons that the pandemic has hit them so much is because of the burden of care and how the burden of care usually falls on women. Do you think that in terms of the workforce, how do you see it recovering after the pandemic?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think you're definitely right that care has been long associated with women. And it's because, women pregnant, and therefore it is assumed that they are primarily responsible for raising children and basically providing all aspects of care for families in the domestic life, right? I think just a little fun fact about myself. I went to an all-girl high school.
Oh.
So, and annually we would do external events like concerts and stuff. And because we're all women students, so everyone does all the work that is associated with men traditionally, like being in charge of security or being in charge of operations and logistics. And so I think from very early on, I've been very fortunate to not be exposed to this notion that care is just for women alone. But again, as we move forward, we do need to realize that not everyone is as fortunate in that regard. And so it's important for us to move forward thinking that and operating on the basis that care is a shared burden, or not even a burden, I would call it. It's a shared joy between men and women. And that's why it's important for companies, for example, to not just give maternal leave, but also give paternal leave, so that both men and women can experience the joy of seeing their firstborn or secondborn or thirdborn and raising them in a shared way, because and it's not just for any one person. So I think post-pandemic we definitely need to do that, and that's for the formal work, I would say.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think all of the examples you mentioned, it's a really important way of changing the mindsets of people. If we don't move away from looking at the responsibilities of care as only a woman's responsibility, then there are, of course, missed opportunities, and we don't start off in the same position, and there are biases that have to be addressed, and this is through changing the mindsets of people.
Yeah.
I think going back to what you were saying, these were examples in the formal work. Do you think that it's different in informal sectors?
Yeah, so I think it's a very important area that we need to talk about. So I was just looking at the statistics from the International Labour Organization. It mentioned that 78% of workers in Southeast Asia are actually informal workers, informal or unregistered workers, and the majority of those informal workers are women. One of the reasons why that's the case is because a lot of informal workers are related to care or associated with care that are associated with women. So we're talking about street vendors, domestic care workers, factory workers, plantation workers, and all of that. There is a lot of inherent biases that basically women are more docile laborers, and so they are more accommodative towards the lack of social protection or legal protection accorded in the informal sector. So that's a very sad reality, but I think if we want to move forward better and build back better after the pandemic, we need to tackle this issue of informal worker, not just for women, but also for men. I think it's important that we think of ways that we can accord better social and legal protection for these workers. And I think one way that we can do that is to start with us as individuals, because I think, for example, in Indonesia, a lot of households employ domestic care workers. These individuals that employ household care workers, they can start by being mindful of minimum wage. That's for one. And secondly, they can be mindful of, for example, BPJS Kesehatan or Health Social Insurance Agency. These people who employ the domestic care workers can register their employees to BPJS Kesehatan, so that when they encounter unfortunate situations where they get sick, then there is enough protection for these workers.
Yeah. I think protection is definitely something that's a safety net, that when it is available, it's a good way to bring everyone to the same, at least equal level of starting point.
Yes.
Besides informal sector, I think the pandemic also accelerated a few sectors in the workforce. For example, there was digitalization,
yes.
And because of that, there are new, jobs of tomorrow. And a lot of the times, people have said that the jobs of tomorrow are more geared towards men, because they are more in the STEM areas, or they are traditionally in roles that maybe women have not have had access to in before. Do you have any ideas of maybe what can we do in these sectors to also encourage women's participation?
Yeah, you're right. Definitely, COVID-19 has accelerated digitalization more than any other phenomena, I think, because after the pandemic, basically everything now virtually is digitalized. We're not just looking to digital platforms for entertainment, but also for work. What used to be in-person meetings have been replaced with virtual meetings and all that. And as we head into the future, I think women in STEM is a very important topic as well. STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, which is commonly thought of as the domain of men. And even that is pervasive in families and in schools and in universities. And I think the first step towards improving the situation of women representation in STEM is to eliminate that bias since very early on, even in very early education schools, systems. We really need to change this bias that women can be just as good as men in STEM, and it's important to instill to women from very early on that they can also excel in this particular area, right? And there have been actually a lot of very good international initiatives and also initiatives led by private companies, even in Indonesia, to support women in STEM, such as giving scholarships or providing courses to help women specifically who are looking to have a career in the STEM area. So I think that's very encouraging. What needs to be done more, I think, is for the government to be more cognizant of these great initiatives and to provide greater support. Maybe companies who are giving out these courses in women in STEM can be given incentive tax or non-tax incentives. Just thinking wildly here, but I think there needs to be a greater recognition, I guess, from the government on best practices led by private sector, and some of these great initiatives can be mainstreamed into national and local policies.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think just sharing from my personal experience, I attended a class on coding, but I remember I was maybe a bit too past my time because it was already once I've done my undergraduate, and so it's, I think, a little more difficult to fully comprehend what I was learning. But I agree that if the biases are removed since we are younger, and maybe including some coding classes, or not even just coding but more of the hard sciences since we are little, it's easier for us to fully comprehend and then understand that this isn't something that's just geared for men, and that women can too be part of this sector.
Yeah, you're definitely right. I think everyone needs to play a part in that. Families, parents, school teachers, university lecturers. Everyone really has to start operating on the basis of not seeing certain professions are just for men or just for women. I think it's very important that we really do see people for their traits and their talents and their skills, and really not about their gender or sexual identity.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And now going back to, I guess, your personal career, I know that you mentioned that a lot of the career you've done so far has been in Indonesia domestically, but I also remember that you studied international relations and have studied abroad as well. Do you think there are maybe some policy benchmarks that Indonesia can learn from and implement it in our own system?
Yeah. So I think one that is particularly striking for me is the policy of paternal leave in countries like New Zealand. They don't just give out maternal leave, but they also give paternal leave. And that is very powerful, not just in terms of giving men the chance and the time to be with their newborns, but actually it sends a very strong message and signal to the society that childcare is not just the domain of women. Obviously, we have to appreciate that women physically carry the children for 9 months, but ultimately the whole pregnancy journey and child raising journey should be shared by men and women. So I think that's a very powerful example from the New Zealand government. I understand also Nordic countries have implemented similar policies, and I think Indonesia can definitely consider that.
Thank you for zooming out of Indonesia. You mentioned examples from New Zealand and Nordic countries, and I think these are good examples that maybe can be considered in the Indonesian system. And now zooming back into Indonesia, this is, I guess, a reminder that Indonesia has committed to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, of which gender equality is an important agenda. And so I think gender equality is a common goal. I think it's not just the job of the government, it's not just the job of the private sector, and it's also not just a job for women to achieve this. It's a common effort that has to be achieved together. So one question that I have for you, one last question before we wrap up, is what do you think can be done to help shape the minds? What can be done to help shape markets and also help shape policies to achieve this together?
Right. It's totally right that we talk about minds, markets, and policies in an integrated manner, because as you mentioned, we can't be working to advance the mindset but then not have the markets changing their operations, or not having those best practices from the market being mainstream to policy. So I think it's important that we talk about them in an integrated manner. That said, in terms of mindset, I think reiterating what I've mentioned, one path forward for us is to not see people on the basis of their gender or sexual identity when we're looking to hire or promote them in the professional workforce. So we see them on the basis of their traits, their skills, and their merits, not on whether they are men or women. I think that's an important mindset that we need to have going forward. In terms of markets, I think the private sector has launched a lot of great initiatives, in terms of maybe rolling out paternal leaves, or maybe, providing daycare facilities in the workplace that would help to have men and women kind of basically share the burden of taking care of children while they're working. And I think these private sector best practices, they need to be scaled. And the only way they can be scaled is if they are mainstreamed into national or local policies. So I think what needs to be changed in terms of policies, I think the government can look at these private sector best practices and see which can be mainstreamed into local and national policies. And we can also do some policy benchmarks, as what I've mentioned about paternal leave. But I do understand that policies need to be mindful of local context, and that's why I think let's work together, the government, the private sector, the community sectors, let's work together to find policies, market behaviors, and mindsets that work for Indonesia for a better gender equality in the world as we head into the future.
Yeah. Those were great solutions. I think I want to reiterate again in terms of the informal sector. You mentioned already about the policies that are still needed, and this is especially important because it's still currently lacking. For example, social security and healthcare, as these are important safety nets to be considered. This has been the first episode of the Breaking Barriers podcast, where we talk about global contemporary problems as well as the collaborative solutions that we can implement together. For those of you listening, I invite you to solve the future of gender equality now and reflect maybe on your own biases, if any of what we mentioned in our conversation was something relevant to you, and maybe how we can work on the solutions together. Thank you again for joining us, Azira.
Thank you, it was a pleasure. Thanks, Indira.
For all of the listeners, we hope you tune in next time, where we will deep dive into issues of gender inequality in the workplace, whether it's in the area of tech or in digital journalism or agriculture. This is an important conversation to be had, and we hope to see you again. And thank you for joining.